Caleb had always been a solitary man. He had lived alone for years, wandering the vast plains of the Wild West with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the open sky. He didn't mind the loneliness, it was the life he had chosen. The days were long, the work was hard, but it was his way of living. He didn't expect much from anyone, and no one expected anything from him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb was out on the trail, herding cattle toward the ranch. The wind was cold, biting at his skin as he rode. His thoughts were far away, lost in the rhythm of the ride when a loud, haunting howl pierced the stillness of the night. His horse tensed beneath him. Caleb's sharp instincts kicked in. Wolves, a pack of them. He had encountered them before, dangerous, hungry, and relentless. They didn't often attack a man unless they were desperate, but a lone traveler could be easy prey. Caleb's hand instinctively moved to his rifle, and he scanned the distance. Through the thick trees, he could just make out a figure in the dimming light. It was a girl, running, her face twisted in terror as she fled from the pack of wolves closing in on her. Without thinking, Caleb spurred his horse forward, urging it into a gallop. His heart pounded as he raced toward the girl, the wolves' growls growing louder with every second. The sound of the wolves closing in on their prey was deafening, but Caleb didn't hesitate. He couldn't. As he drew closer, he saw her more clearly. A young Apache girl no older than 16 or 17. Her dark hair was flying wildly behind her as she stumbled, her eyes wide with fear. She was running as fast as she could, but there was no way she could outrun the wolves, not on foot. Caleb reached for his rifle and, with expert aim, fired a shot into the air. The loud crack of the rifle echoed through the air, sending the wolves scattering for a moment. But Caleb knew it wouldn't be enough. They were hungry, and they wouldn't back down easily. He rode in closer, drawing the wolves' attention away from the girl. One of the wolves darted toward Caleb's horse, teeth bared. Caleb quickly aimed his rifle and shot the animal, its body collapsing to the ground. The others hesitated for a moment, but didn't retreat. They were desperate. Caleb swung his rifle around and fired again, this time hitting another wolf in its shoulder. The pack, now down two of their own, hesitated, growling in frustration. Caleb took advantage of the momentary confusion to grab the girl, pulling her onto his horse in one swift motion. He urged his horse forward, galloping away from the pack, his heart racing. The wolves howled in the distance, but they didn't follow. Caleb didn't stop until they were far enough away, until the only sounds left were the pounding of his horse's hooves and the wind howling through the trees. He slowed the horse to a trot, glancing at the girl beside him. She was shaking, her face pale and wide-eyed, but she wasn't crying. There was a strength in her that Caleb could see, even through the fear. She had survived the attack, but she wasn't out of danger yet. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked, his voice low and calm. The girl didn't respond at first. She simply nodded, her dark eyes focused on the ground as if she were trying to understand what had just happened. Caleb knew she was grateful for the rescue, but she wasn't about to admit it. She was an Apache, and pride ran deep in her people. She had been taught to survive on her own, never to rely on anyone, especially not a stranger like him. Caleb could see that she was hurt. Her arms were scratched up, her clothes torn, and there were bruises forming on her legs from the wolves' attacks. He couldn't leave her like this. He had to get her to safety. "Hang on," he said, urging his horse to move faster. "We're going to my ranch. You'll be safe there." The girl looked at him for the first time since he had pulled her onto the horse. Her gaze was sharp, as if trying to read him, to figure out his motives. Caleb didn't mind. He had never been one for small talk, and he wasn't expecting her to trust him. But he was determined to help her, no matter how tough or independent she was. The ride to his ranch felt long. The moon was rising now, casting a pale light over the land, and the wind had picked up again, colder than before. Caleb kept his eyes on the path ahead, but he couldn't help stealing glances at the girl. She had stopped shaking, but she didn't speak. Her eyes were focused on the distance, on nothing in particular. Caleb didn't know her story, but he could tell she had been through more than her fair share of hardships. When they finally arrived at his small ranch, Caleb dismounted and helped the girl down. She winced as she put weight on her legs, clearly still in pain. Caleb quickly led her to the small cabin, which was modest but warm. He built a fire in the stove, making sure the room was warm before he moved to tend to her wounds. The girl had barely said a word since he had rescued her, and she wasn't about to start now. Caleb handed her a blanket and some food he had left over from the day's meal. He watched her quietly as she accepted both, though she didn't eat. Instead, she wrapped herself in the blanket, staring into the fire, lost in her own thoughts. Caleb wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't the type to offer meaningless words of comfort, but he did know one thing. She couldn't stay out here alone. The wolves wouldn't be the only danger she faced in the wild. There were other threats out there, other people who might not be so kind. He decided to let her rest. She was exhausted, and he could tell that her body needed time to recover. Caleb went about his usual evening routine, tending to his animals and making sure everything was in order for the night. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the girl. Who was she? What was she doing out here alone? What had brought her to this point? He had no answers, but he had a feeling he would find out soon enough. As the night grew darker, Caleb returned to the cabin. The girl was still sitting by the fire, her eyes heavy with sleep. Caleb didn't want to intrude, but he knew he couldn't leave her alone without making sure she was all right. He stepped into the cabin and spoke softly. "You can sleep here tonight. You'll be safe." The girl looked up at him then, her expression unreadable. After a long pause, she nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. Caleb didn't expect her to thank him, and she didn't. But there was something in her eyes that made him think she understood the gesture, even if she didn't fully trust him yet. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Caleb settled down to sleep, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had saved her from the wolves, but he knew the real danger was just beginning, and he was ready to face whatever came next, as long as it meant she would be safe. The fire crackled in the quiet cabin, casting soft shadows on the walls. Caleb could hear the girl's steady breathing as she sat by the fire, her eyes half closed but never fully asleep. There was a tension in the air between them, a space they both seemed reluctant to fill with words. Caleb knew she wasn't entirely comfortable with him, and he didn't expect her to be. But he also knew that the life she had been living before this night had been harder than anything he could understand. Still, it didn't stop him from wanting to know more about her. He had saved her life, but she was still a mystery, a person whose past was written in silence, only waiting to be told when she was ready. The night wore on, and Caleb kept his distance. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but every time she glanced his way, he noticed the strength still there. It was in the way she held herself, in the way she never fully relaxed. Even though she was physically hurt, her mind was sharp, and Caleb respected that. It was what had helped her survive the wolves after all. After a while, Caleb decided to make himself some tea and settled into a chair opposite the girl. He didn't know if she wanted company, but he figured it couldn't hurt. He had a long history of quiet nights spent alone, but tonight felt different. He had this strange feeling that this girl, this Apache girl, wasn't like anyone he had met before. "I've got some food left," Caleb said, breaking the silence, offering her a bowl of beans and cornbread. "You should eat. It'll help you recover." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and accepted the food. Her eyes briefly met his, and in that fleeting moment, Caleb thought he saw a glimmer of gratitude. But she didn't speak. She simply took the bowl, ate in silence, and set it aside when she was finished. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice soft but clear. It was the first time she had spoken in hours, and it startled Caleb a bit. "You're welcome," he replied. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her words slow as if choosing them carefully. "I'm called Ayana," she said. "I'm from a small tribe. We've been scattered." Caleb felt a quiet curiosity stir within him. He had seen many Native Americans in his travels, but he had never met someone from her tribe. "You were separated from your people?" he asked gently, though he could already guess the answer. It was common for the Apache to have been pushed away from their land, scattered by the government or by other tribes. Ayana looked down, her fingers curling around the edges of the blanket she had wrapped herself in. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Our people were attacked. Many of us were captured, some were killed. I ran. I had to survive." Caleb said nothing, letting her speak. He could hear the pain in her words, the weight of everything she had lived through. "I've been alone for weeks," Ayana continued. "Hiding, running. I thought I was strong enough, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked at Caleb, her eyes hardening. "I never thought I would die at the teeth of a wolf." Caleb felt a pang of sympathy. He couldn't imagine what it had been like for her. All the days spent on her own, hiding in the wilderness, trying to survive. She was so young, and yet she had been forced to grow up far too fast. "You're safe now," Caleb said simply. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. Ayanna didn't respond, but she seemed to relax a little, as if his words had taken some of the weight off her shoulders. For the rest of the evening, the two of them sat in quiet companionship. Caleb knew better than to push her to talk about her past. He respected her silence, knowing that people like her didn't easily share their pain. They kept it hidden, locked away, only revealing what was necessary to survive. When the fire burned down to embers, Caleb stood up and walked over to the window. The night outside was still and cold, the stars shining like diamonds in the dark sky. He didn't have much, but he felt he could offer her something that no one else had: peace. "You can stay here as long as you need," Caleb said, his voice steady and warm. "I don't mind the company, and I won't let anyone hurt you, not while you're under my roof." Ayanna looked up at him, her face unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, but then she stood up and walked over to him. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, her voice low, but firm. "But I will not forget it." Caleb met her gaze, surprised by the strength in her words. She was fierce, more so than anyone he had met before, but there was a vulnerability there too, hidden beneath her tough exterior. "I didn't help you for thanks," Caleb replied honestly. "I helped because it was the right thing to do." Ayanna studied him for a long time before she spoke again. "You think I need saving?" Caleb raised an eyebrow at her question. "No, I think you're capable of taking care of yourself. But everyone needs help sometimes." Ayanna was quiet for a moment. Then, almost as if she were testing him, she said, "I don't need anyone." Caleb chuckled softly, not in a mocking way, but with understanding. "None of us are meant to be alone forever." She seemed to consider this, but instead of responding with words, she simply nodded and turned to face the fire again. Caleb let her be. He didn't push. He respected her space. There were many nights he had spent alone, thinking about his past, his decisions, and the life he had chosen. And now, there was something about this girl, a connection maybe, that made him feel like he was no longer as alone as he thought. As the night wore on, Caleb could tell that Ayanna was falling asleep. Her body, exhausted from the ordeal, finally gave in to the rest it had been fighting for so long. Caleb stood up quietly, making sure the fire wouldn't die out completely. He grabbed a blanket and laid it over her, watching her sleep for a moment. It struck him that he had no idea what would happen next. Would she stay? Would she leave once she was well? He couldn't say. All he knew was that the future was uncertain, but for now, they shared this small cabin in the wilderness, two people from different worlds brought together by fate. Before Caleb lay down to sleep, he took one last look at Ayanna. There was a new bond forming between them, unspoken and yet undeniable. She had trusted him enough to stay, and that, in itself, was a beginning. And so in the quiet of the cabin, the night passed slowly, each moment filled with an unspoken understanding. Tomorrow would come, and with it new challenges. But for tonight they were safe, and that was enough.